The most dangerous thing in the last days is not to have your body killed, but to have your loyalty changed. That is where Revelation becomes more terrifying than many people realize, because the final crisis is not only about war, collapse, famine, persecution, or death. It is about worship, it is about allegiance, it is about the invisible line that runs through every human heart, until the whole world is divided not by nations, but by who belongs to God and who has quietly surrendered to the beast. And that is why the middle of Revelation feels so intense. The images become stranger, the symbolism becomes sharper. Heaven and earth begin to overlap, witnesses rise, a dragon rages, beasts emerge, angels cry out, a mark appears, a harvest is prepared. But beneath all of that imagery there is one question pressing harder and harder on the soul of the reader. When pressure reaches its highest point, who will you belong to then? Because Scripture does not present the end as a mere sequence of disasters. It presents it as an unveiling, a revealing, a stripping away of illusion until every false refuge is exposed, until every compromise becomes visible, until every hidden loyalty comes into the light. The world does not simply become more violent, it becomes more revealing. And what is revealed in that hour is not merely the power of evil, but the truth about the human heart under pressure. That is why what John sees next begins with something so small and yet so devastating. Not a throne shaking, not a city falling, not a beast roaring. A mighty angel descends, clothed with heaven's splendor, one foot on the sea, the other on the land, holding a little scroll in his hand. And in that image alone, Revelation tells you something crucial. God is not losing control. Heaven is not reacting in panic. The message is still in his hand. The story is still under his authority. John is told to take the little scroll and eat it. And what happens is one of the most haunting images in all prophecy. In his mouth, it is sweet as honey. In his stomach, it turns bitter. That is not a random detail. That is the emotional signature of prophetic truth. Because the word of God is sweet when it promises justice, vindication, restoration, and the triumph of the kingdom. But it becomes bitter when that same truth must be lived through in a world that hates it. It is sweet to hear that God reigns, bitter to remain faithful while evil seems loud. Sweet to know Christ wins, bitter to walk through the cost of not bowing, sweet to read about glory, bitter to endure the road that leads there. And Revelation refuses to flatter the people of God with shallow comfort. It does not say the truth will always feel pleasant. It says the truth will be worth everything, but swallowing it will cost you something real. That little scroll sets the tone for everything that follows. Because from this point on, the visions are no longer merely cosmic scenes to admire from a distance. They become an experience of collision. Heaven's truth enters earth's hostility. The sweetness of God's kingdom collides with the bitterness of human rebellion. And if you do not understand that tension, you will misunderstand the whole story. You will think prophecy is meant to entertain curiosity, when in fact it is meant to test endurance. There are people who want revelation only when it tastes sweet. They want mystery, they want codes, they want signs, they want the thrill of hidden knowledge. But the moment the word becomes costly, the moment it demands courage, separation, witness, loss, or endurance, many begin to back away. And that is exactly why John had to eat the scroll. Not just read it, not just explain it, eat it, because there is a difference between studying truth and being consumed by it. The final conflict cannot be understood by spectators. It is not given for detached fascination. It is given for loyal obedience. And that is why right after the little scroll, John is told to measure the temple of God. At first, that scene can seem almost quiet compared with everything else around it. But it is not quiet at all. It is surgical. In the middle of chaos, God draws a line. In the middle of confusion, God distinguishes what is His. In the middle of pressure, God still knows His people precisely. John measures the temple, the altar, and those who worship there. Not because God needs information, but because the vision needs to reveal something to us. Divine judgment is never careless. Divine protection is never vague. Divine ownership is never confused. The world may not know who belongs to God. Empires may not know. Crowds may not know. Systems may not know. But heaven knows. And when revelation shows you measurement, it is showing you a God who has not misplaced one soul that is truly His. That matters more than we often realize, because one of the deepest fears in times of darkness is the fear of being swallowed by the crowd, harassed in the noise, forgotten in the shaking. But Revelation answers that fear by showing not first the beast, but the boundary. Not first the threat, but the distinction. Before the world is shown the machinery of deception. The people of God are shown this truth. The Lord still sees the difference between what is holy and what only looks powerful. Yet the scene does not stay still for long, because belonging to God does not mean hiding from history. It means being sent into it, and the next image drives that truth with almost unbearable force. Two witnesses stand in the center of the story like torches in a storm. They are clothed in sackcloth, the garment of grief, repentance, and prophetic burden. They do not enter the world to entertain it. They enter to confront it. Their very presence is a rebuke to a civilization that wants truth silenced. These witnesses are described with symbols that echo olive trees and lampstands, drawing from the language of priestly supply and prophetic testimony. In other words, they stand before God and shine before men. They are not self-appointed voices. They are sustained by heaven. Their power does not come from popularity, institutions, numbers, or image. It comes from the one who sent them, and that is exactly why the world cannot simply ignore them. Holy witness is unbearable to systems built on lies. Everything about them feels severe. Fire from their mouths, power to shut the sky, power over waters and plagues. Whether one reads these details with greater literal or symbolic emphasis, the point remains the same. Their testimony carries real authority. It is not decorative. It is not weak. It is not sentimental. They embody the fierce reality that when God raises witnesses in a corrupt age, He does not merely offer suggestions. He confronts idols. He exposes rebellion. He interrupts the false peace of a deceived world. And yet here is where Revelation cuts against every shallow assumption about faithfulness. The witnesses are not defeated because they failed. They are attacked because they succeeded. The beast rises against them only when they finish their testimony. That detail is everything. Evil does not determine the length of their assignment. Heaven does. Their lives are not governed by chaos. Their deaths are not proof of abandonment. They are permitted to fall only after their witness has been fully delivered. That is one of the hardest truths for the human heart to accept. We often assume that if God is truly with someone, their testimony will be protected from visible humiliation. But Revelation says something far more severe and far more glorious. Sometimes faithfulness will not spare you from public hatred. Sometimes obedience will not keep you from being reviled, exposed, shamed, or seemingly crushed in front of those who celebrate your fall. The question is not whether the world applauds your witness. The question is whether heaven has received it. The beast kills them. Their bodies lie in the great city. The world looks on. People rejoice. Gifts are exchanged as though righteousness itself has died and oppression has won. It is one of the darkest scenes in the book because it reveals how deep human hostility toward truth can go. The witnesses are not merely removed, they are mocked. Their deaths become entertainment. Their silence becomes a party. That is what rebellion looks like when it no longer hides behind politeness. And if you sit with that image long enough, it becomes impossible not to feel the echo of the church's own story through history. Again and again, faithful witness has been opposed not simply with argument, but with contempt. Again and again, the world has treated holy conviction as a threat to its pleasure. Again and again, those who speak for God have been painted as the problem because their presence exposes the deeper sickness underneath. The witnesses are not an isolated episode. They are a pattern, but revelation never lets the darkness have the last word. After the appointed time, the breath of life from God enters them. They stand on their feet. Fear falls on those who see them. And then a loud voice from heaven says, "Come up here." In a moment, the ones the world tried to disgrace are summoned upward by the God the world cannot silence. The same city that celebrated their exposure now trembles under heaven's interruption. That is not only vindication, it is reversal. Do not miss the emotional architecture of that scene. First witness, then hatred, then death, then public shame, then resurrection, then ascent. It is the rhythm of the gospel echoing through prophecy. The world may be allowed to wound the people of God for a moment, but it is never given the right to define their ending. Bodies may fall, voices may be hated, names may be dragged through dust, but testimony that belongs to God cannot be buried forever. And that matters because the final conflict is built on that very pattern. If the witnesses had never fallen, their story would inspire courage. But because they fell and rose, their story creates endurance. It tells the people of God not only that truth is worth speaking, but that apparent defeat is not the final measurement of faithfulness. And in a time when so many fear being misunderstood, rejected, marginalized, or crushed for refusing compromise, Revelation places these two witnesses before us as if to say, your calling is not to survive public approval. Your calling is to finish your testimony. Then suddenly the camera widens, the story lifts. Earth is no longer the only stage. Another sign appears in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet and a crown of stars on her head. She's in labor, crying out in birth pains. This is no longer merely about prophetic voices standing in a city. This is salvation history viewed from above. The people of God are now seen not as a scattered crowd, but as a woman carrying promise through agony. Opposite her appears a great red dragon, not subtle, not disguised, not harmless, massive, violent, hungry to devour the child the moment he is born. Here Revelation exposes what history often conceals. Behind earthly rage there is a deeper hatred. Behind persecution there is an older war. Behind each attempt to destroy the line of promise stands a spiritual enemy whose rebellion reaches beyond politics, beyond empire, beyond any single age. The dragon is not reacting to events. He has always been at war with the purpose of God. The woman gives birth to a male child, one destined to rule the nations with a rod of iron. The child is caught up to God and to his throne. In a few brief strokes, the vision sweeps across incarnation, conflict, ascension, and kingship. Revelation does not linger on every detail because its purpose here is not to retell the story, gospel from the ground. It is to reveal what that gospel meant in the unseen realm. Christ's coming was not a quiet religious event. It was a strike against the dragon's claim, and the woman flees into the wilderness where a place has been prepared for her by God. That image alone is full of paradox. She is pursued, yet preserved. Hidden, yet not abandoned. Vulnerable, yet sustained. The wilderness in Scripture is never simple. It is a place of exposure, testing, dependence, and divine provision, which means the vision is telling us something important about the people of God in history. Preservation does not always look like escape from hardship. Sometimes it looks like being kept by God in the middle of a hostile landscape. That matters because many believers imagine safety in ways Revelation never does. We think protection means the removal of all threat. Revelation shows protection as divine faithfulness in the middle of real threat. The woman still flees, the dragon still rages, the wilderness is still barren. But the place is prepared by God. She is not wandering at random. She is being held inside a provision the dragon cannot see clearly enough to destroy. The enemy is fierce, but he is not sovereign over the root. Then the vision opens still further. War breaks out in heaven. Michael and his angels fight against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fight back, but they do not prevail. And with that, one of the deepest spiritual realities in Revelation comes into view. The dragon is not merely a tempter on the edges of history. He is the accuser, the ancient serpent, the devil, Satan, the one who deceives the whole world and who has stood as the slanderer of God's people. He is cast down, that is the turning point, not because evil vanishes from the earth, but because the legal ground of accusation has been broken by the work of Christ. Heaven erupts with a declaration of salvation, power, kingdom, and authority because the accuser of the brothers has been thrown down. Revelation shows you that part of Satan's power was never just violence. It was accusation, condemnation, the ceaseless attempt to weaponize human failure before the throne of God. That is why the next line is so powerful that it almost feels too sharp to hold. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives unto death. There is the center of the war, not merely by force, not merely by strategy, by blood and testimony. The blood of the Lamb silences the accusation. The testimony of the saints refuses the lie, and willingness to lose life, rather than betray truth, breaks the dragon's intimidation. Notice what this means. The enemy falls from heaven, but he intensifies on earth. The voice of accusation loses access above, so the fury of persecution rises below. That is why Revelation says, "Woe to the earth, because the devil has come down in great wrath, knowing his time is short." In other words, the violence of the dragon is not the confidence of one who is winning. It is the rage of one who has been exposed and limited. His time is not endless. His fury is the scream of a doomed kingdom. The dragon turns against the woman. He pours out a flood after her, trying to sweep her away. Again, the imagery is fierce, but so is the answer. The earth helps the woman. Creation itself becomes a servant of providence. The attack does not land as intended. And when the dragon cannot destroy the covenant people at the level he desires, he goes after the rest of her offspring, those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. That is where the church enters the crosshairs fully. This is why Revelation never permits a comfortable reading of discipleship. To belong to Jesus is to enter the logic of this war. Not because the church seeks conflict, but because fidelity itself becomes a provocation to evil. When a people hold to the testimony of Jesus in an age of deception, they expose another kingdom. And once the dragon is cast down, his strategy becomes clear. If he cannot reclaim heaven, he will try to corrupt earth. If he cannot accuse successfully before the throne, he will try to seduce and terrify the saints. That strategy takes visible form in the next beasts that rise. One comes out of the sea, monstrous, composite, carrying imagery from earlier empires as though all rebellious power has been gathered into one terrifying expression. It is political force swollen with blasphemy. It speaks great boasts. It receives authority. It is admired by the world. It wages war on the saints. This is not merely one cruel ruler in isolation. It is empire as a spiritual instrument, power demanding worship. The beast is frightening not only because it is violent, but because it appears unstoppable. Who is like the beast? People cry, and who can fight against it? That is the language of awe, twisted into idolatry. It mimics the language that belongs to God. That is one of the most sinister patterns in Revelation. Evil rarely presents itself only as open rebellion. It also presents itself as counterfeit transcendence. It wants reverence. It wants the kind of surrender that belongs to worship, not just the kind that belongs to fear. And this is why the sea beast matters so much. The final conflict is not simply about cruelty. It is about power claiming sacred status. It is about governments, systems, and structures swelling beyond their proper place until they ask for more than obedience. They ask for the soul. They ask for devotion. They ask to be treated as ultimate, and whenever earthly power demands what only God deserves. The beastly pattern has begun to show itself, whether in small forms or in final form. Then another beast rises, this time from the earth. If the first feels like open domination, the second feels more subtle, more plausible, more dangerous in another way. It looks lamb-like, but it speaks like a dragon. That contrast is devastating. Outward resemblance to innocence, inward voice aligned with hell. Here deception is not brute force. It is imitation, false spirituality, persuasion in service of idolatry. The second beast exists to make the world worship the first. It is propaganda with religious energy. This beast performs signs. It calls down fire. It animates an image. It compels humanity toward reverence for the first beast. Whether one emphasizes the symbolism or the literal dimensions of these scenes, the pattern is unmistakable. The final alliance of evil is not only coercive power. It is coercive power validated by deceptive wonder. It is the marriage of authority and illusion. It is politics baptized by false spirituality. It is domination given a sacred costume so that resistance feels not only dangerous, but almost blasphemous. That is why this section becomes so dark. Revelation is showing a world where force and deception no longer operate separately. They join hands. One beast threatens. The other legitimizes. One punishes dissent. The other interprets punishment as righteousness. One creates fear. The other creates meaning around that fear. Together they form an anti-trinity of allegiance, the dragon behind them, the beast demanding worship, and the false prophetic power persuading humanity to bow. It is a counterfeit liturgy for a counterfeit kingdom. And if you listen closely, you begin to see why the final battle is not first about weapons, but about worship. Because people do not become servants of evil only when they pick up arms. They become servants of evil when they give ultimate loyalty to what opposes God. Sometimes that happens through terror, sometimes through appetite, sometimes through belonging, sometimes through the seductive relief of fitting in. The beast does not only conquer with pain, it also conquers with the promise that the compromise will make life easier. That is the soil in which the mark appears. The mark of the beast is introduced, not first as a puzzle for sensational decoding, but as the sign of participation in a system of worship and survival. It is placed on hand and forehead, the symbolic centers of action and thought, deed and devotion. It governs buying and selling. It shapes belonging. It marks those who align themselves with the beastly order. The point is deeper than curiosity about technology. The point is ownership through allegiance. This is where many people go wrong. They rush to ask what object the mark might be, what mechanism, what infrastructure, what visible trigger. And while questions about visible manifestation matter, Revelation pushes deeper first. The mark is the externalization of an internal surrender. It is not merely an administrative label. It is the seal of conformity to a rebellious order. It says that thought, labor, participation, and survival have all been bent into agreement with the beastly world. It is a sign that someone has accepted the terms of anti-God civilization. And now the terror becomes personal, because this means the danger of the last days is not only that evil will kill bodies. It is that evil will pressure souls into consent. It will tell people that compromise is practical, that loyalty is too expensive, that faithfulness is unsustainable, that worship can be adjusted privately while public compliance keeps life manageable. The beast does not need every heart to love it sincerely. It only needs enough hearts to surrender for the sake of convenience, security, and place. That is why the number of the beast, 666, should not be handled like a cheap code to inflate panic. In Revelation, numbers carry symbolic weight. 6 falls short of 7, the number associated with divine completeness. 666 becomes the intensification of falling short human power, raised to its highest self-glorification, yet never reaching the fullness of God. It is the number of counterfeit completeness, man enthroned, rebellion systematized, imperfection celebrated as ultimate. A kingdom forever imitating glory and never truly possessing it. So when Revelation says this number calls for wisdom, it is not inviting thrill-seeking. It is calling for discernment. It is telling the saints to see the pattern beneath the spectacle, to recognize when systems are becoming beastly, to notice when power begins asking for worship, to discern when the cost of belonging is your conscience, to understand that the mark is not random. It is the visible form of a deeper spiritual reality. The world will be divided not simply by ideology, but by who has been inwardly claimed. And that is why the contrast that follows feels like sunlight after a storm. John looks, and there is the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who have his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. The counterfeit mark is not the only inscription in Revelation. God also marks his own. The beast imitates because it cannot create original belonging. The dragon brands because he envies the seal of God. The final crisis always reveals whose name you have truly carried. This company with the Lamb is not presented as weak, confused, or barely surviving. They are steady. They sing a new song no one else can learn. They are described in language of purity, devotion, and truthfulness. Whatever one's precise reading of every symbolic detail, the center is clear. There remains a people who have not sold themselves to the beastly order. There remains a people who belong to the Lamb not only in private feeling, but in visible fidelity. Darkness never gets everybody. That matters because Revelation never magnifies evil without also preserving hope. The dragon rages, but he does not own the mountain. The beasts deceive, but they do not get the final anthem. The mark spreads, but it is not universal in the deepest sense. God keeps a people, not a perfect people by their own merit, but a redeemed people marked by the name of the Father and the Lamb. And that name matters because names in Scripture are not labels only. They signify possession, character, and covenant relationship. Then come the three angels, and their messages cut through the air like final alarms before the closing of a door. The first angel proclaims the eternal gospel to every nation, tribe, language, and people. Fear God. Give him glory. Worship the one who made heaven and earth. This is crucial. Even at this late hour, the first announcement is still gospel. The final conflict is not merely a countdown to destruction. It is also a last merciful summons to right worship before judgment falls fully. The second angel follows with a declaration that Babylon the Great has fallen. Not will fall only, but has fallen, as though heaven already sees the certainty of what earth still mistakes for greatness. Babylon is the archetype of seductive civilization organized in rebellion against God. Wealth intoxicated with pride, power adorned with glamour, culture that persuades people to drink corruption as though it were celebration. Her fall is announced before it is narrated in detail, because Revelation wants you to know this early. The system seducing the nations is already doomed. The third angel is the sharpest warning of all. Whoever worships the beast and receives its mark will drink the wine of the wrath of God. That language is severe because the issue is severe. Revelation will not allow the lie that worship can be redirected without consequence. It will not flatter compromise as a neutral option. To give yourself to the beastly order is not merely to make a practical choice. It is to place yourself against the Lamb, and that opposition is not survivable when judgment comes. Then comes one of the most needed lines in the middle of all this severity. Here is a call for the endurance of the saints. That is not an accidental aside. It is the pastoral center buried inside the warning. Revelation is not given to make the faithful obsess over darkness. It is given to strengthen endurance, to teach patience, to anchor obedience, to remind the saints that the point is not merely to identify evil, but to remain loyal under pressure. Discernment without endurance is not enough, and perhaps this is where the whole section presses deepest into the present soul. Because most people do not imagine themselves denying God in one dramatic instant. They imagine themselves surviving, adjusting, negotiating, making room for fear. Revelation answers that temptation by reframing the whole issue. You are not merely managing pressure, you are declaring loyalty. Every accommodation to the beastly spirit is forming someone. Every refusal to bow is also forming someone. The last days expose what repeated choices have been building all along. That is why the Lamb on Zion is not just a comforting image. It is the answer to the entire conflict. The dragon has fury. The beast has spectacle. Babylon has seduction. But the Lamb has a people, not because the world was easy to resist, but because his blood was stronger than accusation, and his worth was greater than survival. That is the hidden victory Revelation keeps pulling into view. The saints are not those who never felt pressure. They are those who decided that Christ was worth the cost. After this, the book moves toward harvest, and again, the imagery is both agricultural and terrifying. One like a son of man sits on a cloud with a golden crown and a sharp sickle. Another angel announces that the hour to reap has come, for the harvest of the earth is ripe. This is Revelation's way of saying that history does not drift forever. Ripening has an end, patience has an appointed boundary, the earth does not remain morally ambiguous without conclusion. A day comes when readiness turns into reaping. Harvest is not random. Harvest is exposure through maturity. What has been growing beneath the surface becomes visible in its true kind. Wheat and grapes are not confused at harvest. Fruit reveals identity, and that is why this image belongs at the end of a section about loyalty. The final crisis is not creating something from nothing. It is bringing hidden allegiance to full ripeness, what people loved, trusted, feared, obeyed, and worshipped will not remain concealed indefinitely. The fields of history are moving toward disclosure. Then another angel gathers the clusters of the vine of the earth and throws them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. It is one of the bleakest images in Revelation because it strips away every illusion that rebellion can be indefinitely managed. Judgment is not poetic exaggeration here. It is moral reckoning, the same world that celebrated the death of the witnesses, marveled at the beast, and drank the wine of Babylon will one day face the winepress of divine justice. The symbolism is intense because the stakes are. And notice the contrast carefully. Earlier there was a cup of seduction. Babylon made the nations drink. Later there is a cup of wrath. The same world that intoxicated itself on rebellion finds that rebellion maturing into judgment. Revelation is full of these reversals. What seems pleasurable becomes poison. What seems victorious becomes doomed. What looks like survival through compromise becomes destruction through allegiance. The book keeps exposing the fatal lie beneath evil's promises. It offers ease for a moment and ruin at the end. By now the shape of the message should be unmistakable. The central conflict is not merely between good events and bad events. It is between rival claims upon worship, between the name of the Lamb and the mark of the beast, between testimony and propaganda, between endurance and compromise, between being sealed by God and being absorbed into the system that opposes him. That is why Revelation feels so close to the nerve, because it is not finally asking what headlines you can interpret. It is asking who you are becoming, and this is where the two witnesses, the woman, the dragon, the beasts, the mark, the lamb, the angels, and the harvest all converge. The witnesses show that truth may be hated, but cannot stay buried. The woman shows that God preserves his people, even in wilderness. The war even shows that accusation has been broken by the blood of the Lamb. The beasts show how evil organizes power and deception into worship. The mark shows how compromise becomes identity. The Lamb on Zion shows that God still keeps his own. So, if you step back from the symbols for a moment, the warning becomes painfully clear. The most dangerous deception of the last days may not be obvious hatred of God. It may be the slow normalization of life inside a beastly order, the quiet training of the soul to accept what once would have horrified it, the gradual exchange of conviction for convenience, the subtle redefinition of worship until people think they can belong outwardly to the system and inwardly to the Lamb without fracture. Revelation says that fracture is real because in the end, neutrality collapses. You cannot stand forever between seals. You cannot sing to the Lamb and finally kneel to the beast without one of those loyalties swallowing the other. That is the terror and the mercy of Revelation. It does not leave the lines blurry. It refuses the fantasy that ultimate allegiance can be postponed forever. The pressure of the last days will force clarity, and for many, that clarity will not begin with dramatic persecution. It will begin with small decisions about truth, compromise, fear, and worship. Maybe that is why this section still speaks with such force now. Not because every final form has fully appeared, but because the patterns already exist. Beastly power is not hard to imagine in a world drunk on control. False prophetic voices are not hard to imagine in an age addicted to spectacle. Economic pressure tied to conformity is not hard to imagine in societies that increasingly punish dissent. The final manifestation may intensify these realities, but the spiritual grammar of them is already familiar, which means revelation is not given so you can stare only at the horizon. It is given so you can recognize the training ground of loyalty in the present. Every time truth costs something, the issue is already there. Every time belonging asks for silence about Christ, the issue is already there. Every time power demands moral surrender for the sake of access, The issue is already there. Every time your conscience is pressured to bend so your life can remain comfortable, the shadow of the mark has already entered the conversation. But the answer is not panic. It is not feverish obsession. It is not shallow sensationalism. The answer is worship that has been purified before the crisis peaks. The answer is a people who know the sweetness and bitterness of God's word because they have eaten it. People who understand that being measured by God matters more than being applauded by the crowd. A people who will finish their testimony. A people who know accusation has already been answered by the blood of the Lamb. The answer is also a recovery of what witness really is. Not branding, not influence for its own sake, not religious performance dressed as boldness. Witness in Revelation is costly truth carried by those who belong more deeply to God than to survival. That is why the witnesses stand so tall in the imagination, even when their bodies lie in the street. They embody what the dragon cannot understand, a kind of loyalty that is not purchased by comfort and not extinguished by death. And perhaps the sharpest mirror of all in this section is this. The beast always offers a way to stay alive in the world by becoming less true. The Lamb offers a way to remain true even if the world becomes less survivable. That is the dividing line. One kingdom says, "Bow and live for now." The other says, "Endure and receive life that death cannot cancel." One seals the forehead with counterfeit belonging. The other writes the Father's name upon a people who can be wounded, but never finally owned by darkness. So the question of revelation is no longer abstract once you see it this way. It becomes immediate. What is shaping your loyalties now? What fears most easily move you? What comforts can silence you? What system do you instinctively trust to secure your life? What do you protect when obedience becomes expensive? The final crisis may one day reach a terrifying fullness, but the roots of its choices are already growing in ordinary moments. And that is why the book speaks so urgently before the end arrives. The dragon wants worship through fear. The beast wants worship through power. The false prophet wants worship through signs and persuasion. Babylon wants worship through seduction and pleasure. But the Lamb receives worship through sacrifice, truth, and love, stronger than death. That is why one kingdom dazzles quickly and decays eternally, while the other often looks weak before it reveals its real glory. Revelation is training the eye to see beyond appearances. What looks triumphant may already be judged. What looks slain may already be reigning. And that takes us back to the opening claim. The most dangerous thing in the last days is not merely that bodies may be threatened. It is that hearts may be bought, because once loyalty is transferred, the rest follows. Thought follows, action follows, worship follows, identity follows. That is why the mark matters so much. It is not interesting because it is mysterious. It is terrifying because it is relational. It marks the final success of a counterfeit claim upon the human person. But there is another mark, another name, another belonging, and Revelation keeps placing that before the church with equal force. The seal of God, the name of the Father and the Lamb, the measured temple, the preserved woman, the conquering testimony, the saints who endure, the people on Zion, the song no compromise can learn. The point is not merely that evil rises. The point is that God keeps a people through that rise. And their deepest protection is not always escape from suffering, but preservation and loyalty. So when you hear about the dragon, do not only think of chaos. Think of a defeated accuser raging on borrowed time. When you hear about the beast, do not only think of future tyranny. Think of power whenever it seeks sacred surrender when you hear about the mark. Do not only think of mechanism. Think of allegiance, hardened into visible conformity. When you hear about the witnesses, do not only think of mystery. Think of the church's calling to tell the truth in a world that would rather celebrate its silence. And when you hear about the harvest, remember this above all. History is not ending in confusion. It is ending in disclosure. The world may look tangled now. Falsehood may seem loud. Compromise may seem practical. Babylon may seem glamorous. The beast may seem untouchable. But none of that will remain masked forever. The sickle will come. The winepress will fall. The mountain of the Lamb will stand. And every hidden loyalty will be shown for what it really was. That is the weight of this vision. It does not ask you first whether you can decode every symbol perfectly. It asks whether you can hear the call to endurance, whether you can refuse counterfeit worship, whether you can love the truth more than your standing, whether you can believe that the blood of the Lamb is stronger than the accusations that make compromise look necessary. Whether you can finish your testimony even if the world misunderstands the shape of your faithfulness before heaven vindicates it. Because Revelation never promised that the faithful would always look victorious in the middle of the story. Sometimes they look hunted, sometimes hidden, sometimes outnumbered, sometimes publicly humiliated, sometimes silenced for a moment. But beneath all of that, another reality is operating. They are measured by God, preserved by God, cleansed by the blood of the Lamb, strengthened to endure and held inside a kingdom that cannot be overthrown by dragons, beasts, or empires, no matter how terrifying they appear. So do not read this section as a gallery of strange end-time images only. Read it as a call to spiritual sobriety, a call to discernment, a call to costly faithfulness, a call to name the real battle correctly. The line is being drawn not merely across governments, economies, or religions, but through consciences, through loves, through acts of worship, through daily consent. And the question beneath the whole vision remains as sharp now as it will be then. Whose name will be found on you? Because once the masks come off, once the dragon's rage becomes open, once the beasts no longer hide their demands, once the world begins dividing fully around worship and survival, there will be no refuge in vague spirituality, no safety in mixed allegiance, no durable shelter in compromise. Only two paths will remain visible in their true form: the way of the Lamb, costly and eternal, or the way of the beast, seductive and doomed. That is the war behind the curtain. And if that war has already exposed the dragon, the witnesses, the beasts, the mark, the Lamb, and the harvest, then one question still remains hanging over the story. If these dark powers have finally shown their face, how does the great system that intoxicates nations, seduces kings, enriches itself through corruption, and opposes God with dazzling beauty finally collapse? How does Babylon fall when her power looks untouchable? That is where the next part of the story turns. Because the battle over loyalty does not end with the mark. It moves into the exposure and judgment of the great city that taught the world how to desire the wrong kingdom. And once you see what Babylon really is, you will never read the seductions of this world the same way again. Why not divine range? I say, why